The knife bit into the bark before the sun had finished climbing over Calhoun County, and what Marcus Carter found underneath made his stomach drop like a stone through still water. The cambium layer, that thin green line between life and death in a peach tree, had gone black as charcoal. Not brown. Not struggling. Dead. He'd been at this since 4:47 a.m., moving through the eastern row with a headlamp strapped to his forehead, the beam cutting through fog thick enough to taste. 9 trees. 9 trees in 12 months, all showing the same pattern, healthy one season, dead the next, and nobody could tell him why. Marcus straightened up, his knees popping like dry kindling, and looked out across the 12 acres his father had left him. 212 peach trees, or what was left of them after a decade of drought, freezes, and whatever this new thing was that was picking them off one by one. He'd planted his first tree at 7 years old, standing on his father's boots while the old man showed him how to spread the roots, how to pack the soil just firm enough, how to talk to something that couldn't talk back. "You listen to him, Marcus," his father had said, a man who'd worked 30 years in a textile mill before saving enough to buy this patch of red clay. "They'll tell you what they need if you pay attention." His father had been dead 11 years now. The trees had stopped talking. Marcus had done the math last night at the kitchen table, bills spread out like a losing poker hand, $4,127 in the bank, $312 spent yesterday on 14 buckets of white latex paint at the hardware store on Main Street, and a mortgage payment due in 3 weeks that would take almost half of what was left. His daughter found him at the tree line just as the fog started thinning. Lily Carter was 10 years old and built like her mother, small for her age, with eyes that saw too much and a mouth that knew when to stay shut. She'd been that way since Claire died. 4 years old at the funeral, wearing a dress her grandmother had picked out, asking where Mama went and why everyone was crying. Marcus had told her the truth because he didn't know how to lie to her. He still didn't. "Daddy." Her sneakers were worn through at the toes, the left one splitting along the seam where the canvas met the rubber sole. She'd need new ones before spring. She was holding a thermos in both hands, steam curling from the spout. "I made coffee. I watched the YouTube video 3 times. Marcus took the thermos. The coffee was terrible, too weak, grounds floating on top, and it was the best thing he'd tasted all morning. "You're supposed to be sleeping." "Couldn't." She stood beside him, looking at the dead tree like it was a person she'd known. "Is that another one?" "Number 9. The one Grandpa planted?" Marcus didn't answer. He was looking past the dead tree, past the row of survivors, toward the eastern fence line where the oldest peach tree on the property stood alone. His father had planted it the year Marcus was born, 1985, a Redhaven variety that should have been dead 10 years ago but kept producing fruit so sweet the local church ladies fought over who got the bushels. Right now its branches were bare, but that wasn't what Marcus was looking at. He was looking at the trunk, where something had changed in the last 48 hours. He walked toward it, Lily falling in beside him without being asked, her small boots crunching on the frost-hardened grass. Up close, the tree was still alive. He could see buds forming at the tips of the branches, tiny pink promises that summer would come again, but the bark on the southwest-facing side had split. A vertical crack, maybe 8 inches long, running from the first scaffold limb down toward the graft union. Fresh. Still losing sap. "Daddy, is Grandpa's tree okay?" Marcus crouched down, running his thumb along the edge of the crack. The wood underneath was still green. Still fighting. But the crack was bad, and he knew what came next if he didn't figure this out. Sunscald. Southwest injury. The thing he'd read about in the county library 3 days ago when he'd finally found something that matched what he was seeing. Temperature swings in late winter, the sun warming the bark during the day, the cold snapping it back at night, over and over until the cells ruptured and the tree girdled itself to death. Except that didn't explain why only his trees were dying. Dale Whitmore's orchard, 800 acres of peaches less than 2 miles down the road, wasn't showing a single dead tree. Dale had money for frost protection, for wind machines, for the kind of irrigation system Marcus couldn't afford. Dale had also been trying to buy Marcus's 12 acres since the day after Claire's funeral. "It's fighting," Marcus said finally. "That's all any of us can do." Lily leaned against his shoulder, and for a moment they just stood there, the two of them and the old tree and the fog burning off as the sun finally cleared the tree line. Then Marcus heard the rumble of a diesel engine on the county road, and he knew without looking that it was Dale's truck. By the time Marcus got to Main Street Hardware at 8:15, the story was already making the rounds. He'd stopped to pick up the paint, 14 buckets of white latex, enough to coat the trunks of every tree he had left, because if sunscald was the problem, white paint was the fix. Reflect the sunlight. Keep the bark temperature stable. Marcus never claimed to be a scientist. But he knew how to measure things. So he measured. For 7 straight days, starting before sunrise and ending after Lily's bedtime, Marcus walked every row of the eastern orchard with a soil thermometer, a compass app on his cracked iPhone, and a yellow legal pad that had belonged to Claire. The pad still had her handwriting on the first 3 pages, a grocery list, a reminder to call the insurance company, a doodle of a sunflower she'd drawn while on hold, and Marcus wrote around her words like they were still part of the conversation. What he found made him angry in a way that surprised him. Not hot anger, not the kind that made a man throw things or punch walls. Cold anger. The kind that settled into your bones and stayed there. The easternmost row, the one with his father's tree at the north end, was getting hammered by wind that the other rows never felt. Whitmore had clear-cut his land. Every oak, every hickory, every scraggly pine that had served as a natural windbreak for 3 generations of Carter peaches, gone. Stumps and scrub grass now. And without that barrier, the winter wind came screaming across Whitmore's open fields and hit Marcus's eastern row like a freight train with no brakes. "You knew," Marcus said aloud, to no one. "You knew exactly what you were doing." He wrote it all down. Wind speed estimates based on branch deflection. Soil temperature differentials, the eastern row was running 3 to 4 degrees colder at root level than the interior rows. Sun exposure maps showing the southwest-facing bark heating up to 47 degrees Fahrenheit by 2 p.m. and then crashing to 22 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. The trees were basically cooking and freezing, over and over, and the ones on the eastern edge had it worst because they got no protection from the wind that accelerated the temperature swing. On Wednesday, he showed the legal pad to Lily over breakfast. She was eating frosted flakes and swinging her legs under the kitchen table, her hair still wild from sleep, and she looked at his diagrams with the serious expression of a child who understood that grown-ups were worried about something. "What do the red lines mean, Daddy?" "The red lines are where the trees are getting hurt the most." She traced one of the lines with her finger. "That's Grandpa's tree." "Yeah, baby. That's Grandpa's tree." She was quiet for a moment, chewing her cereal, and then she said, "So we have to help them." And that was that. Lily had a way of cutting through everything, the fear, the money stress, the exhaustion that lived behind Marcus's eyes, and landing right on the truth. They had to help the trees. So they would. The paint arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 14 5-gallon buckets of white latex exterior paint, the kind you'd use on a barn or a fence. Marcus had ordered it from a supplier 2 counties over because he wasn't about to give Main Street Hardware any more of his business after the way Earl behind the counter had smirked when Marcus explained what he needed. The supplier had given him a discount for buying in bulk, and the delivery driver, a young Latino kid named Hector who couldn't have been more than 22, helped him stack the buckets in the equipment shed without asking a single question about why a man needed that much white paint in the middle of February. When Marcus cracked open the first bucket on Saturday morning, Lily was sitting on an overturned crate nearby, wearing one of Claire's old flannel shirts over her pajamas. The sleeves were rolled up 6 times and still covered her hands. "Saw min fi sun ke ha daddy?" she asked, tilting her head. Marcus dipped a wide brush into the paint, watching the thick white latex coat the bristles. "Because the winter sun is playing tricks on them. During the day, it warms up the bark so much the tree thinks spring is here. Then at night, when it gets cold again, the bark cracks. The white paint reflects the sunlight. Keeps the temperature steady." He paused, looking for the right words. "It's like giving them a white coat. Like the one you wear when it snows." Lily nodded slowly, processing. Then she slid off the crate, picked up a small brush, the one Marcus used for detail work on the porch railing, and walked over to the nearest tree. Without being asked, without being told, she crouched down and started painting the lowest part of the trunk, the part Marcus always had to bend awkwardly to reach. He watched her for a second, this small person in her dead mother's shirt, painting a tree her grandfather had planted, and something tightened in his chest. Not sadness, exactly. Something closer to a promise. They worked side by side for 3 hours. Marcus did the upper trunks and the scaffold limbs, reaching as high as he could with an extension pole. Lily did the base of every tree, her strokes careful and deliberate, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth the way it always did when she was concentrating. By noon, they'd finished 17 trees. 195 to go. Robert Gaines showed up without calling first, which was exactly the kind of thing Robert Gaines did. Marcus was halfway up a ladder, paint dripping down his forearm, when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He didn't turn around. He knew the sound of that county-issue Ford Ranger the way farmers know the sound of a neighbor's tractor. It meant someone was coming to tell you something you didn't want to hear. Gaines stood by the fence line for a long time before he said anything. The emergency alert came through the old kitchen radio at 4:17 p.m., crackling through the static like a voice from a war Marcus had never fought but somehow knew by heart. The National Weather Service has issued a freeze warning for Calhoun County and surrounding areas. Temperatures expected to drop to 23 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Wind chill values as low as 15. This warning remains in effect until 9 a.m. tomorrow. Marcus's hands stopped moving. The brush hung suspended over the sink, water dripping off the bristles in a rhythm that matched the sudden pounding in his chest. 23 degrees. 15 with wind chill. He walked to the kitchen window and stood there for a long time, looking out at the eastern orchard. 212 peach trees, every single one of them painted white from trunk to scaffold limb. The paint would protect the bark from splitting, from the freeze-thaw cycle that had been slowly killing them for 3 winters running. But it wouldn't do a damn thing for the buds. "Daddy?" Lily's voice came from the kitchen table, where she'd been coloring in a book about ocean animals. She'd stopped humming. "What's wrong?" Marcus didn't turn around. He was doing math in his head, the kind of math that felt like counting down from a bomb. 212 trees. Maybe 3 hours of daylight left. He had 40 rolls of burlap in the equipment shed, each one 50 feet long. He'd bought them 2 years ago for a frost scare that never materialized, and they'd been sitting there ever since, collecting dust and spider webs. 40 rolls. 50 feet each. That was 2,000 feet of burlap. Enough to wrap maybe 150 trees if he worked fast and didn't stop. They had 212. "We need to wrap the trees," Marcus said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "The cold's coming tonight. Real cold. The kind that kills." Lily slid off her chair. Her coloring book fell to the floor, open to a page with a half-finished octopus, but she didn't pick it up. She was already pulling on her boots, the pink ones with the unicorns on the sides that Claire had bought her 3 years ago, back when she was still small enough to need help with the laces. She didn't need help anymore. "How many?" Lily asked. "All of them." They loaded the truck together in silence. Marcus hauled the rolls of burlap out of the shed, his shoulders burning with the memory of the painting marathon from the week before, and Lily stacked them in the truck bed with the kind of precision only a 7-year-old could manage, making sure each roll was flush against the next, no wasted space. She'd picked up a roll of agricultural fabric too, the thin white stuff that looked like giant sheets of tissue paper, and Marcus hadn't even noticed her doing it. That was Lily. Always 3 steps ahead, always paying attention to things no one else saw. By the time they reached the first row of trees, the sun had already started its slow slide toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Marcus didn't look at the sky. He was already unrolling the first length of burlap, his hands moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 farm tasks, wrapping the fabric around the canopy of the nearest tree like he was swaddling a baby. Tight enough to hold. Loose enough to breathe. 3 wraps around the crown, then spiral down the scaffold limbs, then tie it off at the trunk with the twine he kept in his back pocket. Lily worked beside him without being asked. She couldn't reach the high branches, but she wrapped the lower limbs with the agricultural fabric, her small hands reddening in the cold air, her breath coming out in little white puffs. She didn't complain. Not once. Not even when the fabric snagged on a broken branch and cut a thin line across her palm, a scratch that welled up with tiny beads of blood. She just wiped it on her jeans and kept going. Marcus watched her out of the corner of his eye, and something in his throat closed up so tight he had to stop for a second and just breathe. This was not how it was supposed to be. Claire was supposed to be here, with her laugh and her warm hands and her way of making even the hardest days feel like something they'd chosen instead of something that had chosen them. She was supposed to be the one tying fabric around the lower branches while Marcus did the high work, the two of them moving in the rhythm they'd built over 12 years of marriage, the rhythm that had made this farm feel like a home instead of just a piece of land with debt attached to it. But Claire was 4 years gone, and Lily was 7 years old, and here she was, wrapping trees in the fading light with a bleeding hand and a face set in determination. "You're doing good, baby," Marcus said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I know, Daddy," Lily said, and she didn't look up from her work. "We got 165 left." He almost laughed. Of course she was counting. The sun dropped below the tree line, and the temperature dropped with it. Marcus switched on the truck's headlights, angling them toward the orchard, and then pulled out the 2 flashlights from the glove compartment. He gave the bigger one to Lily. She held it in both hands, aiming the beam at whatever tree Marcus was working on, and the light shook a little because she was shivering now, the cold seeping through her jacket in a way that the burlap couldn't stop. Marcus took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders without saying anything. The cold broke sometime around 3 a.m., and Marcus knew it the way he knew everything about this land, not by looking at a thermometer, but by the way the silence changed. The wind had been screaming through the orchard for 18 hours straight, a sound like metal tearing, and then suddenly it wasn't. The stillness that followed was worse. It meant the temperature had bottomed out, and now the real damage was setting in, the kind that happened in the dark while everyone was pretending to sleep. Marcus stepped out onto the porch at 6:47 a.m., and the first thing he noticed was the grass. It crunched under his boots like broken glass, every blade coated in a layer of frost so thick it looked like snow. The second thing he noticed was the silence. No birds. No wind. Just the kind of quiet that settles over a place after something terrible has happened, the kind that makes you want to turn around and go back inside and pretend you never saw any of it. But Marcus Carter had never been the kind of man who pretended. He walked the eastern row first because that was where the oldest trees were, the ones his father had planted 32 years ago when Marcus was still in diapers, the ones that had survived every freeze and every drought and every mistake a man could make with a piece of land. The burlap was still there, wrapped tight around the canopies like he'd left it, and the white paint on the trunks had held through the ice, and for a moment, just a moment, Marcus let himself believe it had worked. Then he got close enough to see the bark. The cambium layer had split. Not on every tree. Not even on most of them. But on enough that Marcus stopped counting after the first dozen, because counting meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant facing facts he wasn't ready to face yet. The splits ran vertical down the trunks, thin cracks where the sap had frozen and expanded and torn the trees open from the inside, and the sap itself had oozed out and frozen mid-drip, little amber teardrops that caught the morning light and glittered like something precious. It would have been beautiful if it wasn't death. That was the thing about peach farming that most people didn't understand. The line between beautiful and dead was thinner than a piece of bark, and you could spend your whole life walking it and still end up on the wrong side. He kept walking. Row after row, tree after tree, his boots crunching through the frozen grass, his breath coming out in clouds that hung in the air behind him like ghosts. He checked the wraps on every canopy, the paint on every trunk, the ground around every root system. Most of the trees were still alive. He could see it in the way the branches held their shape, the way the buds from last fall were still firm and tight, waiting for spring. 209 trees out of 210 had made it through the night. By any farming standard, that was a miracle. By any farming standard, Marcus Carter had just pulled off something that the old-timers in Calhoun County would be talking about for years. But Marcus wasn't counting the ones that had survived. He was looking for the one that hadn't. He found it at the eastern edge of the property, where the fence line met the old drainage ditch his father had dug by hand in 1989. The peach tree there was the oldest on the farm, the one Marcus's father had planted the day Marcus was born, the one that had been here before the irrigation system and the tractor shed and the house itself. It was the tree Marcus had climbed as a boy, the tree Claire had stood under in her wedding dress, the tree Lily had taken her first steps beneath while Marcus held his breath and prayed she wouldn't fall. The trunk was split from the ground to the first scaffold limb, a crack wide enough that Marcus could fit his whole hand inside. The sap had poured out and frozen in a sheet down the bark, amber and gold and catching the light like stained glass, and the branches that had held peaches every summer for 3 decades were bare and brittle, the buds black and dead. The tree had given everything it had for 32 years, and the freeze had taken the rest. Marcus stopped walking. He stood there in the frozen grass with his hands at his sides and his jaw set tight, and he did not cry. He did not curse. He did not do any of the things a man is supposed to do when he loses something that has been part of his life longer than almost anything else. He just stood there, breathing, and the cold air burned his lungs, and the silence pressed in on him from all sides, and somewhere behind him he heard the screen door slam. Lily. She'd put on her boots and her jacket, the one that was still too big for her because Marcus had bought it a size up so she could grow into it, and she was walking toward him through the frozen grass with her math textbook still clutched against her chest like a shield. She didn't say anything when she reached him. She just stood beside him and looked at the tree, and her small face was very still, the way it got when she was trying to be brave about something that was breaking her heart. Marcus didn't turn around. "You should be inside, baby." "I know." She didn't move. "Is it dead?" He could have lied. He'd lied about a lot of things in the 4 years since Claire died, about how much money they had, about whether he was tired, about whether everything was going to be okay. But Lily was 7 years old now, and she'd wrapped 210 trees in burlap with a bleeding hand, and she deserved the truth. "Yeah," he said. "It's dead." The 209 peach trees that had survived the freeze were doing something he'd never seen before, not in his father's time, not in his own 32 years on this land. They were exploding. Not just budding. Not just recovering. Exploding with a kind of furious, defiant life that made the old-timers at the feed store shake their heads and mutter about beginner's luck. Lily came tearing through the rows with her hair coming loose from its braids and her sneakers muddy to the ankles, and she was laughing. "Daddy," she shouted, skidding to a stop in front of him and grabbing his hand with her small, sticky fingers. "They're all pink. Every single one." Even the ones at the back by the ditch. I know, baby. By June, the orchard was a different kind of problem. And by the first week of June the branches were drooping under the weight of fruit so heavy Marcus had to prop up half the younger trees with 2x4s just to keep the limbs from splitting. The peaches were the color of honey and gold and sunset all mixed together, and they were big. Not just big. Huge. The kind of peaches you saw in magazines and figured they'd been photoshopped or grown in some laboratory in California. Marcus picked one from the tree his father had planted the year Lily was born, the one at the end of row 3 that always produced earlier than the rest, and he bit into it standing right there in the dirt with the juice running down his chin and onto his shirt, and he closed his eyes. It tasted like every summer he'd ever known. Like his father's hands, cracked and calloused, handing him a slice of peach over the kitchen sink. Like Claire's laugh when she'd stolen one from his lunch pail on their third date and bitten into it and gotten juice all down the front of her white dress, and she hadn't even cared, she just laughed and said, well, now I matched the sunset. Like Lily at 3 years old, sitting in the grass under the oldest tree with peach juice smeared across her cheeks like war paint, grinning up at him with those big brown eyes that were exactly her mother's. He opened his eyes and looked at the orchard, at the 209 trees heavy with fruit, at the branches bending low like they were bowing to something, and he let himself feel it. Pride. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that settles into your bones and stays there. Gary Sutton showed up on a Thursday afternoon in late June, and that was when Marcus knew things had really changed. Sutton was the regional buyer for Georgia Peach Packers Cooperative, a man who'd been in the business for 40 years and had forgotten more about stone fruit than most people would ever learn. He was a short, thick-built white man with a white mustache and a permanent squint from decades of walking orchards in the Georgia sun, and he had not set foot on the Carter farm in 11 years. Not since Marcus's father was still alive and the orchard was producing enough to justify a buyer's time. In the years since, Marcus had sold his crop through a broker who took a 15% cut and never once asked about quality, just tonnage, just numbers on a spreadsheet. Sutton walked the rows for 2 hours. Marcus walked with him, Lily trailing behind with her math book because she'd insisted on coming, and Marcus had learned a long time ago that arguing with a 7-year-old who'd inherited her mother's stubbornness was a losing proposition. Sutton didn't say much. He pulled peaches off the trees, turned them over in his hands, cut into them with a pocket knife and studied the flesh like he was reading a book. He checked the sugar content with a refractometer he pulled out of his back pocket, squinted at the reading, checked it again. When he was done, he stood at the end of row 1 with his hands on his hips and looked at Marcus for a long moment. You know what premium tier means, son? Marcus knew. Premium tier meant the peaches went to high-end grocery chains and farmers markets in Atlanta and Charlotte instead of being trucked to a processing plant and turned into syrup. Premium tier meant a price per bushel that was 40% higher than standard. Premium tier meant a contract and a guarantee and a future. Yes sir, Marcus said. I know what it means. Sutton nodded slowly. He pulled a contract out of his truck, a thick sheaf of papers that had been sitting on his dashboard, and he handed it to Marcus with a pen that had the cooperative's logo on the side. I've been doing this 40 years, Sutton said. I've seen maybe 5 orchards produce fruit like this. And I've never seen it come from trees that should have been dead 6 months ago. Marcus looked down at the contract. The numbers blurred for a second, and he had to blink hard to clear his vision. Lily was standing beside him now, her small hand finding his, and she squeezed twice, their old signal. You okay, Daddy? Yeah, baby. I'm okay. He signed the contract right there in the dirt with the sun beating down on his neck and the smell of ripe peaches filling the air like a promise. The harvest took 3 weeks. Marcus hired 4 men from town to help with the picking, and Lily appointed herself quality control, standing by the sorting table with a serious expression on her face and rejecting any peach that didn't meet her standards. Too small, she'd say, holding up a perfectly good peach and squinting at it like a tiny loan officer evaluating collateral. Robert Gaines showed up on a Tuesday afternoon with a leather portfolio under his arm and the look of a man who'd spent 3 weeks not sleeping. He stepped out onto the porch before Gaines could knock. "I was wrong," Gaines said. The words came out stiff, like they'd been rehearsed in a dozen different variations on the drive over from the university. "I went back and reviewed everything. Every study, every paper, every field observation on Southwest injury going back 40 years. The white paint application, the timing of the application, the thermal differential you documented, it's all there in the data. You were right, Marcus. The science supports it. I just wasn't ready to see it because it didn't come from my research. I want to write a case study," Gaines said. "About your orchard. About what you did here. I've already talked to the Journal of Pomology, and they want to fast-track it for their spring issue. This could change how small orchards across the Southeast handle winter prep." "Okay," he said. "But you write it here. You walk the rows with me. You talk to the people who helped. You don't just put my name on a paper and call it a day." The screen door banged open behind Marcus, and Lily came running out with her father's notebook in her hands. The same yellow legal pad he'd used to record every observation, every temperature reading, every decision during that brutal winter when the cold had tried to take everything and failed. She'd been 7 then, a tiny quality control officer with a serious expression and a talent for rejecting peaches that didn't meet her standards. Now she was 8, and she held the notebook out to Gaines like she was presenting evidence in a court of law. "This is my daddy's book," she said. "He wrote down everything. Every single day. Even the days when he was really tired and his hands were bleeding from the burlap." Gaines took the notebook carefully, the way you'd handle something fragile and irreplaceable. He opened it to a random page, and Marcus watched his eyes move across the handwriting, the crude diagrams, the temperature logs recorded every 2 hours through the longest night of the freeze. Gaines's expression shifted, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked like a scientist seeing something genuinely new. "This is remarkable," he said quietly. "This is primary data. This is." "That's what saved the trees," Lily said, and her voice was fierce with a pride that made Marcus's throat tight. "Not just the paint. The paying attention." Gaines looked at her, then at Marcus, and something passed between the two men that didn't need words. The acknowledgement that some things couldn't be learned in a laboratory, that some knowledge only came from walking the same ground every day for 32 years, from burying your father and your wife in the same red clay, from raising a daughter alone and teaching her that the land would take care of you if you took care of it first. They planted the new tree on a Saturday morning in October, in the spot where the old patriarch tree had stood for 63 years before the Southwest injury had finally claimed it. Marcus had cleared the deadwood months ago, but he'd left the roots in the ground because his father had always said the old roots made the soil ready for new growth, that they broke up the hardpan and left channels for water and nutrients that a young tree could follow down into the earth. Lily dug the hole herself, or at least she tried to. The shovel was too big for her, and the red clay was stubborn, and after 10 minutes of determined effort she'd managed to excavate about 4 inches of dirt. Marcus stood back and let her work, because his father had done the same for him when he was 8 years old and trying to prove he was strong enough to be useful. When she finally looked up at him with frustration in her eyes, he took the shovel and finished the hole in 6 clean strokes, then handed it back to her so she could place the sapling. The young tree was a redhaven, the same variety as the patriarch that had stood in this spot since before Marcus was born. Its root ball was wrapped in burlap, and Lily handled it with the same careful attention she'd once used to sort peaches at the harvest table. She lowered it into the hole, and Marcus knelt beside her to pull the burlap away and spread the roots out in the red clay. "This tree is yours," Marcus said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Your grandfather planted a tree for me when I was your age. Right over there, by the eastern fence line. That tree's still producing, 42 years later. Now I'm planting this one for you. Lily looked at the sapling, at its thin trunk and its handful of leaves, and then she looked up at her father. Is it going to be okay? The freeze won't kill it. We're going to paint it white, just like the others. We're going to watch it, and measure, and pay attention. And it's going to grow. Marcus put his hand on the trunk of the young tree. It's going to grow, and one day you're going to pick peaches from it, and you're going to remember that you planted it with your own hands. Lily placed her palm against the trunk beside her father's, and she whispered something that Marcus couldn't quite hear, something that was just between her and the tree and the red clay and the October sky. Then she stood up and started shoveling dirt back into the hole with her hands, because the shovel was too slow and she wanted to feel the soil moving through her fingers.